Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents American History, a very short introduction, by Paul Boyer. Narrated by Lee Goettl. Preface. Of the many challenges confronting anyone rash enough to set about writing an American history, perhaps the most formidable is simply to penetrate the dense clouds of myth, preconceptions, and ideological abstractions that sometimes seem to envelop the nation's history so completely that the unadorned reality disappears in the mists. From the earliest European discoveries of the lands that lay westward across the Atlantic, writers invested them with hopes, dreams, and wild imaginings. Although these vast continents were home to several million human beings and complex societies, Europeans envisioned them as enticingly empty and full of promise, literally a new world. In a book published in 1516, 24 years after Christopher Columbus made landfall in the Caribbean, the English philosopher and statesman Thomas More imagined an ideal society, which he called Utopia, situated on an island off present-day Brazil. In More's fictional New World, harmony, cooperation, and equality prevail. Property is held in common, and the lust for gold is unknown. In a nice touch, chamber pots in More's Utopia are made of gold, evidence of the prevailing contempt for the worthless metal. Centuries later, as tidal waves of immigrants poured into the United States, many carried in their mental baggage fond images of the promise of their future homeland, symbolized by the Statue of Liberty in New York Harbor. The 1883 poem by Emma Lazarus that is inscribed on its base ends, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses, yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door." For some, the dream came true. For others, it collapsed in bitter disappointment. For most, everyday reality, with its mix of achievements and setbacks, soon replaced idealized fantasies. For the millions of enslaved Africans transported to the Americas by force, no preconceived illusions intruded on the grim reality of their immigrant experience. Others invested the New World with religious significance. Columbus became convinced in his later years that God had guided his voyages of discovery, fulfilling biblical prophecies of a future millennial age. Much later, the New England Puritans drew inspiration from the conviction that America would play a key role in an unfolding divine plan culminating in Christ's earthly kingdom. Even today, many American evangelical believers continue to envision a special place for the nation in God's cosmic scheme, or sadly conclude that the United States, corrupted by worldly pursuits, has forfeited the divine favor it once enjoyed. In semi-secularized form, notions of American exceptionalism seeped into the work of historians and textbook writers who presented highly selective versions of the nation's history as a story of freedom, opportunity, and endless progress, blessedly free of the dark and exploitive features that defaced less favored societies. Such self-serving interpretations gradually faded under the battering of events and the leaching of supernaturalist assumptions from historical scholarship. Yet as recently as the 1980s, President Ronald Reagan could still inspire many as he evoked ancient images of America as a shining city on a hill, enjoying a uniquely favored destiny. For others, abstract conceptions of America and its meaning took more sinister forms. For Marxist ideologues and vociferous opponents of neocolonialism and economic imperialism, the United States stands as the epitome of late capitalism, extending its corporate tentacles everywhere in the search for markets, cheap labor, and natural resources. Still others, treasuring indigenous folkways and regional cultures, have denounced America as the source of a debased and corrupting global mass culture. While not without merit, such stereotypes hardly convey the full story. For Islamist revolutionaries, gripped by the vision of a worldwide righteous order willed by Allah and set forth in the Quran, the United States looms as a massive impediment, the great Satan, blocking fulfillment of the dream. These varied mythologies, idealized abstractions, and ideological constructs, while fascinating to historians of ideas, stand in the way of understanding America's actual history, stripped of preconceptions or extraneous agendas. Perfect objectivity is another illusion, of course. The listener will not find in this book one overarching Procrustean interpretive thesis into which everything is forced to fit. Certain broad realities will structure much of the narrative: immigration, urbanization, slavery, continental expansion, the global projection of U.S. power, the centrality of religion, the progression from an agrarian to an industrial to a post-industrial economic order. Yet in delineating such large themes, the work also acknowledges the diversity of the American experience, the importance of individual actors, and the crucial role of race, ethnicity, gender, and social class in shaping the experience of specific groups within the larger tapestry of the nation's history. This brief introduction to the vast topic of U.S. history avoids either an excessively upbeat, rose-tinted approach or an unduly negative one. To be sure, from a contemporary perspective, much in American history, like much in the history of many nations, tempts one to censure and moralizing judgment. The gap between historical reality and the lofty rhetoric of chauvinists, politicians, and flag-waving patriots even invites ridicule and irony. Yet such a stance involves its own distortions. Throughout, the aim has been to present the story in a critical, yet balanced and reasonably non-ideological fashion, mostly leaving it to the listener to make such judgments as seem warranted. American history is the story of one society among many, distinctive in some ways, yet sharing in the common human condition. It comprises one brief, unfinished chapter in the great volume of world history, the cumulative record of what the philosopher Immanuel Kant called the crooked timber of humanity. This small book makes no pretense of being final or definitive. It represents the best efforts of one observer, himself a product of the society and a citizen of the nation whose history he is recording. Anyone who undertakes a brief history of America, one that can be consumed in a single setting, faces additional challenges. Much must be omitted, anecdotal digressions regretfully bypassed, and corroborating evidence for broad generalizations left to bulkier studies. Yet the discipline of brevity has its advantages. Such a concise format forces one to make tough judgments about what was truly significant, to focus on the main threads of the story, and to pinpoint the key turning points and themes of lasting significance. And this format also places a premium on clarity and readability, in fairness to consumers willing to spend a few hours in the company of an unknown author. I hope this work, at least in part, meets these multiple challenges. Madison, Wisconsin, January 2012. Chapter 1. Beginnings. Prehistory to 1763. Contemporary Americans, immersed in the busy rhythms of 21st century life, rarely pause to reflect that they dwell in a land that has been inhabited for millennia. Human settlement on the continent we call North America, after the Florentine cartographer Amerigo Vespucci, began at least 15,000 years ago, as bands of people in present-day Siberia came by water or across a now-vanished land bridge into today's Alaska. As migration continued and numbers increased, these first Americans spread southward and eastward, encountering regions of widely divergent climate and topography. Distinctive groups with differing languages, social organization, religious practices, and sources of livelihood gradually evolved. In present-day New Mexico, one group, the Anasazi, built settlements called pueblos, crafted jewelry and decorated pottery, and wrested a living from the arid soil. Farther east, a major civilization arose at Cahokia, today's East St. Louis, where the Mississippi and Missouri rivers converge. Along the Atlantic coast, other groups or tribes engaged in hunting, farming, and fishing. They established diplomatic relations, occasionally fought wars, and maintained extensive trading networks. In today's upstate New York, leaders of 5 large tribes came together sometime after 1450 to form an alliance, the Iroquois Federation. On the western plains, around the Great Lakes, And in today's upper Midwest, other groups pursued agriculture, fishing, and buffalo hunting, depending on their region's ecology. By 1500, the North American population comprised an estimated 7 to 10 million people. Millions more lived in Mesoamerica and South America, where a series of civilizations, Mayan, Aztec, and the still expanding Incan Empire, had flourished for more than a millennium. These civilizations remained unknown in Europe. Leif Erikson and other Norse voyagers had reached the northeastern tip of North America as early as 1000, and even established a short-lived settlement in Newfoundland. But apart from such isolated contacts, the peoples of the Americas and Europe knew nothing of each other's existence. This would soon change, however, with momentous implications for both. The Age of European Exploration. Late 15th century Europe seethed with intellectual ferment, technological innovations, and economic changes. Seeking faster trading routes to Asia, Portuguese navigators ventured around the tip of Africa and on eastward to India. Others contemplated an even more daring route, westward across the Atlantic. One of these, the Italian Christopher Columbus, persuaded the Spanish monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella to finance a voyage. Miscalculating the size of the earth and blissfully unaware that vast continents lay in the way, Columbus, on August 3, 1492, set out from Palos, Spain, with a 3-ship flotilla bound for Asia. Instead, he made landfall on October 12 on an island he called San Salvador. Still convinced that he had found the Indies, he called the local islanders Indians, and the name stuck. A tangle of economic, political, and religious motives drove this exploratory fever. Columbus himself, who made 3 subsequent voyages, was gripped by ambitions for wealth and honors, and zeal to convert the Indians to Christianity. He also saw his voyages as fulfillments of biblical prophecies, an early instance of a persistent tendency to view America as the object of God's special interest. The monarchs who financed these probes into the unknown sought to extend their domains, outshine their rivals, and acquire the fabulous riches that many believed abounded in what Shakespeare in The Tempest called this brave new world. The spread of European settlements. The watery trail blazed by Columbus soon became heavily traveled as Europe's seagoing powers staked their claims. Spanish settlements in present-day Florida, St. Augustine, 1565, and New Mexico, Santa Fe, 1609, as well as in the Caribbean, Mexico, and Central and South America, brought a tide of Spanish-speaking soldiers, adventurers, colonial administrators, and Catholic missionaries. The Dutch soon followed. In 1609, Henry Hudson, an English navigator employed by the Dutch East India Company, sailed up the river that now bears his name. In 1625, the Dutch East India Company established New Amsterdam on Manhattan Island, purchased from the local Lenape Indians. The company granted lands along the Hudson to proprietors, called patroons, who extracted taxes and fees from the tenant farmers who settled the region. The English came late to this race for empire, but soon made up for lost time. The Protestant Reformation that reached England in the 1530s gave England's American colonies, except for Maryland, a strongly Protestant cast. Maryland, established in 1632 by Cecilius Calvert, a Catholic, on a grant from Charles I, sheltered English Catholics fleeing persecution at home. England's first permanent foothold in North America lay in a region that the English called Virginia, after Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen. In 1607, a motley group of some 600 settlers, financed by a company of investors called adventurers, reached Virginia and built a fort, Jamestown, named for Elizabeth's successor, James I. The adventurers' hopes for riches from gold and silver faded fast, and disease, starvation, and Indian attacks soon carried off most of the initial settlers. However, tobacco, first cultivated in Virginia in 1611, became a profitable export as a pipe-smoking vogue swept Europe. In a 1604 pamphlet, James I had denounced tobacco as loathsome to the eye, hateful to the nose, harmful to the brain, and dangerous to the lungs, but to little effect. More English colonies spread southward, from North and South Carolina to Georgia, eventually encountering Spain's outpost in Florida. Tobacco reigned supreme in these southern colonies, supplemented by rice and indigo. The Protestant Church of England drew the most adherents, but the region's religious mosaic also included Scottish Presbyterians, who favored more decentralized church governance, Quakers, espousing simple living and Christ's guidance or inner light within each individual, and Methodists and Baptists preaching personal conversation and heartfelt religion over forms and rituals. Farther north, in present-day Massachusetts, a small company of English religious dissenters who had wholly separated from the Church of England planted a settlement called Plymouth in 1620. These pilgrims, as they became known, arrived from Holland, where they had been living in exile. In 1621, they held a harvest feast, shared with local Wampanoag Indians, which evolved into a major American holiday, Thanksgiving. A history of the settlement by the first governor, William Bradford, written in simple, unadorned prose, ranks as an early classic of American literature. The larger, more historically significant Massachusetts Bay Colony was established at Boston in 1630. The founders were not separatists, but Puritans, so called because they desired to purify the Church of England of surviving popish practices. Later caricatured as joyless prudes, the Puritans were mainly distinguished by a set of ecclesiastical beliefs. Worship should be austere and Bible-based, church and civil authority wholly distinct, each congregation autonomous and self-governing, and church membership restricted to persons who could attest to a personal conversion experience. After initial struggles, New Englanders prospered, achieving high levels of health and longevity. Settlements spread south to Rhode Island and Connecticut, and north to New Hampshire, Vermont, and Maine. Along with farming, fisheries, and urban occupations, they conducted ocean-going trade. Carrying timber, grain, naval stores, and dried codfish to England and England's island colonies in the West Indies, these New England ships brought sugar and molasses, mainly for distilling into rum, from the West Indies, and tea, furniture, dishware, and other manufactured goods from England itself. In the Middle Atlantic region, Pennsylvania, New York, Delaware, and New Jersey rounded out England's North American colonies. In 1681, Charles II granted a charter to William Penn, the son of a naval admiral who in 1660 had helped restore the English monarchy after years of civil war. This charter granted young Penn sweeping powers to establish and govern a new colony. A Quaker convert, Penn considered his namesake province a holy experiment. Under his leadership, Pennsylvania welcomed persecuted English Quakers as well as European religious dissenters, including Swiss and German Mennonites. In 1664, amid a broader imperial conflict between England and the Netherlands, New Amsterdam's governor surrendered to an occupying English force. Renamed New York after the Duke of York, the future King James II, the colony became a thriving, ethnically diverse commercial center with a fertile agricultural hinterland in the Hudson Valley. As the Dutch patroons gradually lost power, individual farm ownership on the New England model became the rule. Delaware, originally a Swedish fur trading post, passed to New Netherlands and then to the English. New Jersey, carved out of New York by James II and granted to a contentious group of proprietors, became a royal province in 1702. Natives and Newcomers, a Fateful Encounter. American historians once self-servingly mythologized pre-Columbian America as a virgin land, a virtually empty wilderness. In fact, the European colonizers confronted extensive, complex, and long-established native societies. With profound implications for both newcomers and natives, this encounter took varied forms, from negotiations, trade, and strategic alliances, to bloody conflict, new diseases, smallpox devastated Indian communities which had no immunity, and misunderstandings arising from differing cosmologies and social systems. In the Spanish colonies, missionaries and secular administrators viewed the natives as laborers, potential converts, and, sometimes, deadly foes. A 1680 Pueblo and Apache uprising left some 400 Spanish officials and priests dead. 12 years later, the Spanish reasserted control. Christopher Columbus himself established the template for the newcomers' view of the Aboriginal population. "They ought to make good and skilled servants," he wrote. "I think they can very easily be made Christians. I could conquer the whole of them with 50 men, and govern them as I please." In English settlements, relations were at times reasonably harmonious. Sometimes colonists and Indians joined forces against a common enemy. In Connecticut in 1637, for example, the colonists allied with the local Mohegans and Narragansetts against the Pequots. During this operation, Connecticut militiamen burned a Pequot village and slaughtered several hundred men, women, and children who were desperately trying to escape. Relations often turned exploitive and violent, a situation exacerbated by differing views of property rights. To native peoples, the land was for use and could be shared. Europeans viewed land ownership as contractual and exclusive. From these differences, and the colonists' inexorable expansion onto native lands, sprang bitter conflicts. In Jamestown, a 1622 uprising by the local Powhatan Indians decimated the settlement. In 1763, Scots-Irish settlers along the Susquehanna River, accusing Pennsylvania's Quaker leaders of neglecting frontier security, slaughtered and scalped peaceful Conestoga Indians in nearby villages. In New England, simmering tensions exploded in 1675 through 76 as the Wampanoag sachem Metacom declared war against the ever-encroaching newcomers. Indians struck across the frontier, killing some 2,500 settlers. The colonists retaliated with equal ferocity, killing many Indians and selling prisoners into slavery. When Metacom was captured, colonists displayed his severed head as a grim trophy of war. The colonial period, in short, began a tragically persistent pattern of native peoples decimated by conflict, new diseases, and the relentless advance of white settlements. By 1800, the U.S. Indian population stood at about 600,000, a pathetic remnant of the estimated 2.2 million on the eve of European colonization. Slavery takes root in America. This era also saw the introduction of slavery, planting the seeds of civil war and a noxious harvest of racism. Prevalent in ancient civilizations, slavery had long flourished in Africa and the Arab world. Now, like a spreading virus, it crossed the Atlantic. The first slave ship arrived in Jamestown in 1619, and many more followed. Initially, Africans blended into a larger population of unfree laborers, including white indentured servants, who worked for a contracted period of time for employers who paid their passage to America. But as indentured servants fulfilled their obligations, they and their descendants entered the free labor force. Africans, by contrast, cultural and ethnic outsiders, their dark skin signifying their unfree status, became a permanently enslaved class. A 1705 Virginia law defined slavery as a perpetual condition transmitted through the mother, thereby including the offspring of white masters and female slaves. From small beginnings, slavery spread into the Spanish and Portuguese colonies, and England's colonies in the West Indies and North America. British slave ships dominated this human traffic, but New England ship owners participated as well. By 1790, the number of enslaved persons in North America, concentrated in the tobacco and rice colonies of Virginia, Maryland, and farther south, but present throughout the colonies, stood at some 700,000. Periodic slave uprisings in New York in 1712, South Carolina in 1739, were brutally suppressed. Isolated moral protests by some New Englanders and Pennsylvania Quakers and Mennonites accomplished little. Woven into colonial society and economic life, slavery would survive into the 1860s, and its after-effects far beyond. A new society takes shape. In popular memory, and in the textbooks of earlier times, the nearly 300 years of American history from 1492 to 1776 flicker randomly in disjointed, semi-mythic images. A beautiful Indian princess saving John Smith's life in Jamestown, resolute pilgrims stepping ashore onto Plymouth Rock, the Dutch buying Manhattan Island for a few trinkets, accused witches hanged in Salem, romantic Spanish missions in California. Yet this era gave rise to social patterns and modes of perception that would long endure. In addition to the fraught interactions of European settlers, native peoples, and enslaved Africans, other colonial-era realities had crucial long-term implications. Long before the Declaration of Independence, England's American colonies experienced de facto independence, enjoying a measure of self-governance and economic autonomy. While the British government claimed ultimate power, in actual practice, the colonies increasingly managed their own affairs. As they did, many colonists scarcely thought of themselves as British subjects, and chafed under the authority and deference claimed by officials dispatched from London. Similarly, colonists increasingly saw their economic interests in local terms, rather than through the lens of England's imperial system. To be sure, English authorities resisted this process. Following a theory called mercantilism, which viewed England and its colonies as a single economic unit controlled from London, Parliament enacted a series of navigation acts from 1651 through 1733 to integrate the North American and West Indian trade into the larger imperial economy. In this view, the colonies would supply raw materials, while importing manufactured products and consumer goods from England. In some ways, mercantilism did stimulate colonial economic activity, encouraging shipbuilding, fisheries, tobacco cultivation, and the production of naval stores, for example. But in the economic, as in the political realm, colonists increasingly looked to their own interests rather than those of distant England. Achieving independence, in short, was a process, not a single event. Religion loomed large in colonial America, and ministers exerted intellectual and social leadership. Yet this was a diverse religious culture. No single denomination held sway throughout the colonies. Anglicans, numerous in Virginia, constituted a minority elsewhere. Puritan Congregationalism was mostly confined to New England. Quakers, powerful in Pennsylvania, had little influence elsewhere. Even within each colony, enforcing religious conformity proved difficult. When Roger Williams, pastor of the Salem, Massachusetts church, was banished in 1635 for his heterodox views, he and his followers simply migrated to nearby Rhode Island. In western Pennsylvania, Scots-Irish Presbyterians challenged the Quaker leadership in Philadelphia. In Virginia, Baptists and Methodists resisted the authority of the Church of England. By the late 18th century, deists in Virginia and proto-Unitarians in New England rejected Orthodox Christian dogma altogether. Some lamented this diversity, but in fact, it stimulated religious vitality. In a free market of competing religious groups, with no established church, religion's overall influence thrived. This diversity, coupled with the core Protestant belief in individual responsibility for one's own salvation, stimulated surges of religious enthusiasm that further undermined ecclesiastical hierarchies. A wave of revivalism in the 1740s, the so-called Great Awakening, swept the colonies under the preaching of a touring English evangelist, George Whitefield, and a host of homegrown itinerants. Jonathan Edwards of Massachusetts, an early proponent of the revival, terrified the unsaved with his sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, 1741. A learned theologian, as well as pastor and revivalist, Edwards drew upon current theories of the will in order to defend emotional preaching. While mastering the works of John Locke and other Enlightenment thinkers, Edwards reasserted orthodox Christian doctrine, including a Calvinist view of God's omnipotence and human sinfulness. His collected works extend to 26 volumes, an output cut short by his premature death in 1758 as he prepared to assume the presidency of Princeton College in New Jersey. Preaching in welcoming churches or in the open air, revivalists called on sinners to repent. Mere baptism or church membership would not suffice. Spawning missionary enterprises and new denominations, popular piety is another of the colonial era's enduring legacies. The means have changed, from open-air exhortation to televangelism in suburban megachurches, but evangelical faith and missionary zeal remain alive and well in 21st century America. The New England Puritans, with a strong sense of divine purpose, were confident of their special destiny.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?